Acts 27:20. While you're turning there, last time we saw the beginning of Paul's journey to Rome. Now he's been being transported because of his appeal to Caesar. And we did see some wonderful leadership qualities from Paul. Even though he isn't technically supposed to be leading anything on this trip, he's a prisoner on this ship there. But leaders do lead by example, and that's what commands the respect of others, not necessarily the title that they hold. And so good leaders do care about others, and that's evident by Paul's actions last time. He's already guaranteed to make it to Rome, because Jesus appeared to him while he was in prison and told him he would go to Rome and spread the gospel there also. And so he's guaranteed to survive this trip. But he is looking out for the others on the ship. And so if the Romans die on this boat and the letter that they're carrying to Caesar is lost in the Mediterranean Sea, then Paul is absolutely free then. And he can just go on to Rome and do whatever he wants. The formalities of a trial or anything like that will cease to exist. But he does care about those people because many of them are unsaved. And that's what he's concerned about. But when all hope is gone on this trip, they're caught in this hurricane, Euroclydon, then Paul steps up, begins to offer the way to escape with their lives. He's getting those instructions from God. And they have left the fair havens against Paul's advice. And you remember instead they followed the captain and the pilot, and of course the majority of the crew felt the same way. And so they've taken their advice, and now they're in a hurricane, the Euroclydon. They're coming from the northeast. And so we'll continue this week here in the middle of this storm, and we'll back up. I know we read some of these verses last time just to kind of set the scene, and then we'll carry on. But Acts 27:20 says, "And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them, and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded, and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again, and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern, and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in all in the ship 260 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast, and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Now, we're seeing Paul's leadership abilities again coming to the front here, and as we said earlier, that's not his role. He's not the leader on this ship. In no way does he have a leadership title or a leadership role on the ship there, but he is leading by example here. And we see in our world today, it's harder and harder to find people who will fill leadership positions. I don't know if you recognize that or not. The post office struggles with that all the time, finding managers and things to take those positions. Churches struggle with that too, finding pastors. I know of at least one again right now, a different one than we prayed for before, that doesn't have a pastor, and they're praying for somebody. And it seems like there are plenty of preachers around, but they don't want to commit to that and be, tied to that type of responsibility week after week. And when I say it's hard to find leaders, we're not just talking about good leaders. We're just talking about anybody that are willing to take the position. At the post office, they say that just a warm body. We just need anybody sometimes, just to fill in. But we see the same problems in homes today too, where fathers aren't really willing to lead the family the way they're supposed to, and some of that I believe is out of fear, afraid that they'll do something wrong or lead the family in the wrong direction. But if they fail to lead and then it goes south, well, then maybe they can't be blamed. Well, that's not true according to God. Whether you choose to lead or not as the husband or the father, you're still accountable for the family. So either way, it still falls on us. But leadership isn't really proven until there's a crisis, though, until there's some real problems that show up. I remember a time years ago at the post office, especially when we were over in the old building. I don't know, you weren't even working there. You probably weren't either. But we were over in the old building, and they had a lot of older workers there. And nobody had to be told what to do. They just came in, they sorted the mail, they packed it up, they delivered it, they came back, and we'd have times when the postmaster would have to be off, and nobody came in and filled in for them. Somebody just had to do a little bit of paperwork to satisfy somebody on up the chain, and after that, nobody had to have a boss. You did your job, and that works until there's a problem, until there's a crisis, and then you do need somebody that can lead. And so, but the captain of the ship and the pilot of the ship and the centurion who's head over all the prisoners in this instance, and most of the people on board are all in the same shape. And when they're in the middle of the sea here in this hurricane, they have panicked, absolutely panicked. And then after they panicked and they've tried everything that they can, now they've just lost all hope. They just assume we're going to die here in the Mediterranean Sea, and it's over, and just waiting for that. But that's not Paul, though. I like that after a long abstinence, he waits a while, right? He doesn't just jump in right off the bat. He waits for a while, and he's temperate, and he's under the control of the Holy Spirit, and so his actions aren't dominated by fear. They're controlled by his faith in God, and he trusts God. Back in Acts 27, we'll pick up on verse 27 is where we left off last time. He says, "But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country." And I brought our map again, just so you can see this. But when he talks about in the Adria there, now they're 14 days from Fair Havens, and now they're almost to Malta or Melita. there. But the Adria there is not this. It's not the Adriatic Sea up here by Italy and Greece. It's not. The Adria is this area in the middle of the Mediterranean. So when they're talking about being in the Adria there, they just know that they're in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. They don't know where in the middle they're at. And so it's midnight. They're in this horrible storm. There's, of course, no visibility. They don't have any stars or anything like that to guide them by. And so there's only one way that they can know that they're close to land, because they can't see the land. And that is, they can hear the waves crashing onto the shore. They're close enough to hear the waves. And so that's different than just the waves in the sea. They can hear them crashing onto the shore there, and so they know that they are close to, it says some country, but they're talking about some land there. And so the distance from Clauda, now Clauda, you remember, was the island down here, a little teeny island down below Crete that they tried to hide behind. They went under it to get a little shelter from the wind when they left Fair Havens and realized that they weren't going to be able to go to Phoenix where they'd hoped to go. And so the wind pushes them from the northeast, and they tried to get a little shelter from there. But the distance there, and from verse 16 there, from Clauda to Malta is 476.6 miles. Now, I know that's very specific, but some really smart navigators and people like that have calculated that a ship this size, to get from Clauda to Malta, in a moderate ability, they're trying to fight the wind, they're trying to stay out of Syrtis Major because there's a reef down here that they don't want to get into, because that'll definitely sink the ship. That's a graveyard of ships down there. So they're fighting against that, and they're getting pushed that way. But the navigators have figured a ship this size in this type of wind will go about 36 miles in a 24-hour period of time in these conditions. Now, if that's true, it would take them exactly from Clauda, it would take them exactly 13 days, 1 hour and 21 minutes to go from Clauda to Malta there. Now, if you add the 1 day that they sailed from Fair Havens to Clauda, that puts us right at 14 days. Now, how long have they been in the sea from Fair Havens to Malta? When they hear the water crashing on the shore there in verse 27, it's been 14 days. Exactly 14 days. Now, even though they're fighting the wind that's driving them, God has taken them straight from here to Malta. They have no idea which direction they're going. They have no idea. But God has steered them straight to that place. Look at verse 28. He says, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Now, sounded is an odd word for us. When we think of sounded, I do anyway, I'm thinking of sonar. You know how they take sonar and they can tell the depth of things. Some of you guys got fish finders and things like that, and you can tell that's how those things work. And but that's not what this is at all. It's not about, they don't have some high-tech sounding device there. That sounding is actually where they took string with a weight on it, and they dropped it down into the sea, and when it hit the bottom, they can measure it. And that's how they're checking the depth there. A fathom there is the distance. If you stretched your hands out, an average man stretched your hands out straight out to the side, that's the distance from the tip of your middle finger to the tip of your middle finger. An average man, full-grown man, that'll be about 6 feet. It's supposed to be about your height, but I'm only 5'10", and I checked mine. Mine's a little bit longer, so it's pretty close, about 6 feet. So when you're talking about fathoms here, 20 fathoms is 20 times 6. That's 120 feet deep when they check it the first time. And then the next time, it's 15 fathoms, right, which makes it 90 feet. Now, if the water's getting more shallow, what do they know about the shore? It's got to be getting closer. They can't see it, right? And so, but they know they are getting closer. But look at verse 29. It says, Then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast out 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. Now, I would think, oh, it's pushing us right toward the shore. We can hear the waves crashing on the side. Let's just ride this baby in. That's how I would think, because I'm an idiot. I don't know anything about sailing and navigation and those kind of things. You know, it seems good to me, but because the water's getting shallower and they're getting closer to land. But these type of ships don't go to shore. We talked about that before when they were trying to repair the ship and they were doing the undergirding. And then we talked about the boat. The boat is the little dinghy that would normally they'd pull behind with a rope. But if the storm got too bad and they felt like that thing was going to sink or they were going to break the rope because it's taking on too much water, they would actually hoist it up, either into the boat or up onto the side of the boat. And that's what they did. And so that's what's happening here. But these big ships, they don't go to shore. That's what the dinghy is for. That's what that small boat is for. If they ram the big ship into the shore, what will happen to it? It'll destroy it. It will. It'll destroy it. Now, my sister ran a ski boat. Now, they're pretty durable. You know, they're fiberglass, and she was watching her husband, my brother-in-law, ski down in South Carolina. And you're supposed to have 2 people in the boat. One to watch the skier, one to watch where the boat's going. There's a reason for that. She did not. And so she got so enthralled with watching him ski that she ran their ski boat, and he was going right at the last second, about the time she plowed the ski boat right up on the shore. Right? It did destroy it. It just did too much damage to the motor and stuff, and it didn't sink it, but it, dry docked it and it ruined it. And so you imagine those ships now boats are built a lot better than they would have been in Bible times, and so they don't want this thing to hit the shore if they can help it, because not only will it wreck the boat, but it'll likely kill a lot of the passengers, because when the boat crumbles, it'll collapse on them and trap some and those type of things. And if they have a reef around this, rocks or sandbar or something like that, they don't want to hit that either, because they'd be even further away from the land when they hit that. And then you've got the task of trying to get to the shore. And so even more would die. So for them to just blindly sacrifice their only means of transportation would be foolish also, because they don't know which island this is yet. Right? They're going to figure it out, but they don't know yet. Right? They don't know if it's inhabited by people. They don't know if anybody else is living on this land or not there. They don't know if there's any food there. They don't know if any other ships ever go there. I got to thinking about Gilligan's Island again. I don't know why I keep thinking about Gilligan's Island. They go to this island there. Well, it did happen to have food and coconuts and that kind of stuff there. But there's nobody else there. And there are no ships that come there. Right? So it's not an ideal place to wreck. And that's the same thing. They don't want to just wreck on some island that nobody goes to, right? Doesn't have the proper things to sustain them and those kind of things. And so what they do is, when they realize they're getting close to the shore but they can't see the shore, they throw the anchors out the back of the ship. That's what the stern is. And so hoping that the ship will hold together until they can see a little better in the daylight. That's what they're hoping for. Now, they're being driven toward the island. They know the water is getting shallower, so they're going toward the island. And so they do put the anchors in the rear, in the stern. And so what that happens is the wind is pushing them that way. The water is pushing them that way. If they put the anchors that way, when they wake up in the morning, of course they're not going to sleep, but when they wake up, or when the day breaks in the morning, which direction will the ship be pointing? It'll still be facing the island. That's what they want. They want it. That's why they throw the anchors out the back. And so, look at verse 30 there. It says, and as the shipmen, now that's the crew, and as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under color, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. Now this is the crew. The crew is getting ready to abandon ship. That's what they're getting ready to do. they're getting ready to get into the little dinghy, into that boat, right? And they're going to abandon ship. Now, if the crew bails on the ship, you know it's really bad. They're not even going to, they don't think this thing's going to even hold together till morning. And so they're going to get in that little boat. Under color there means under pretense, which means they're acting like they're going to put some anchors out in the front of the ship, but what they're actually doing is letting that boat down so they can get in it. That's what they're doing there, and they're going to use it for a lifeboat and try to wash up on shore. Now, you'd have a much better chance of surviving a shipwreck in a dinghy. If it got washed up on shore or slammed into the land there, they'd have a much better chance of surviving that than if this big ship slams into the shore. For one reason, when that dinghy gets slammed into the shore, usually it either just upsets it or they're right there at the land because it's sitting on top of the water. But not so much with the big ship, but because it does trap people and those type of things. And so the crew knows that, and it's time for them to part ways from the rest of the passengers, and we understand that to some degree, because this dinghy, this little lifeboat thing, the shore boat that they have, it won't hold everybody, will it? No. And we see the selfishness of sinful man. Who are the crew concerned about now? It was their responsibility when they took passengers and took cargo. It was their responsibility to take care of everybody originally. But now they say, well, doesn't look like anybody's going to make it out. So if anybody ought to survive this, it probably ought to be us. It probably ought to be the crew. And they're not concerned about anybody else on the ship now, only themselves. Now, if the ship starts ripping apart, they've cast anchors out the back, they're holding it there, but the waves and stuff are still beating against the ship. They're hoping that daybreak will come so they can see at least what they're heading toward. But if the ship starts ripping apart in this storm, who's going to try to get into the dinghy? All 276 people are going to try to get into the lifeboat, into the dinghy. What will happen to the dinghy if 276 people try to get into it? It'll do the same thing as the ship. It'll just sink. That's it. They'll swamp it and it'll sink, and that'll be the end of it. And so they're here. The crew says, well, it's got to be every man for himself. You know, we can't take a chance that we're going to have to get in the lifeboat because everybody else is going to try to get in the lifeboat now, and that's exactly how the world lives. You know, they may help other people when everything's going good, but in a crisis, who are they concerned about first and foremost? Just themselves. Just themselves. Look at verse 31. Paul sees it. Right? He says, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Right? Now these are the same kind of instructions that we get about salvation, isn't it? You either get saved God's way or what? You don't get saved. There's no, we're going to try it our way and let God help and nothing like that. It's God's way or nothing there. And so the question is now, does the centurion and the soldiers believe Paul, who is trusting in God? That's the question here. You know, everything so far has come to pass exactly the way Paul said that God has told him it would. Right? And so he does believe Paul. Plus, what chance would the centurion, the soldiers, the prisoners, and the rest of the unskilled passengers have of getting this ship to the right place without the crew? Slim to none. Right? Slim to none. Right? And so they decide it's best that the crew stay on the ship. Look at verse 32. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. Now, I like that. That's full commitment, isn't it? That's full commitment. This little dinghy, this little lifeboat, that they have tried really hard to preserve that up until now. They've really tried hard to keep that because it's really a necessary part, a necessary tool for them. Right? And so, the centurion and the soldiers, they don't just say, no, hoist it back up or nothing like that. No, they run over and take their swords and say, nah, well, get rid of that thing. This won't be a problem no more. And they cut the ropes. That was it. Let it go crashing into the sea, and it is gone. Right? It's gone. It's wrecked and done. Right? And so now they are trusting completely in God's plan through Paul. And that's exactly the way it has to be. Right? If we were trusting part in ourselves and part in God, as we said before, that's not salvation. It's either all God or no God. That's the choice. Right? But you notice Paul didn't tell them to cut the dinghy loose. He didn't tell. That probably would have come in real handy down the road, but he didn't tell them to do that. Right? But it does show their commitment. When Paul says they've got to stay in the boat, right? They said, oh, well, we can guarantee they'll stay in the boat. We'll cut the lifeboat loose, cut the dinghy loose, and then that'll solve that. And so whatever we're trusting in besides God, right? Those things have to go. That's what happens in salvation. When we trust our life completely to God, we surrender completely to God, then whatever God says needs to go, that's what has to go. Now, God doesn't say that we have to give up all of our money, all of our possessions, all those type of things. Right? We do see with the rich young ruler in Luke 18, we won't turn there, but you know that story there. Right? What did Jesus tell the rich young ruler? Go, sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Come follow me. Now, he didn't tell everybody that. But that guy, he was depending on his money. And Jesus was showing him, you've got to depend completely on God. It can't be God and your money and your wealth. And so that's why he told him to do that. And you remember what happened? Went away sorrowing. Wasn't willing to commit totally to God. But Acts 27:33 and 34. Finally, what they've been looking for. He says, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. Now when he's talking about meat, he's of course talking about grain. He's talking about some food there for him. So the day is breaking. The ship's still intact. It's survived until daybreak at least. And so hope is still alive. Paul tells them to eat. Now, who's in control of the ship? God first, but who's in control of it after God? It's Paul. It's Paul, right? The centurion didn't say, I think we need to eat something. The shipmaster, the pilot, or the captain, they didn't say, well, I think we need to eat some food. We've gone, 2 weeks without anything. Paul is the one that says, you need to eat. You fasted for 2 weeks. You're going to be weak in that state. And it's going to take some energy to get from the boat to the shore there. And so Paul encourages them to do that. Verse 35 and 36. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And so Paul thanks God for the food, and then he eats it. He leads by example, and they follow him. They follow him. Verse 37, he says, and we were in all in the ship 216 souls. All 276 passengers are still safe. Still in the boat, but they're still safe. Verse 38, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. Now, they got rid of the rest of it. You remember they already lightened the ship a couple times, right? The crew lightened it. Then the passengers helped lighten it. Anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, they're trying to get it off, get the ship sitting a little higher in the water so it's not taking on so much water. But now, if you're going to run a large ship like this aground, if you're actually going to take it to the shore, then they want it as light as possible so it'll sit higher in the water. Now, why do you want it higher in the water?
So you hold
You can get closer to the shore if it's higher in the water. If it's sticking way down there, they'll stop way short of the shore there. And so they can't get in as close, and so they've just dumped all of it out. Now that's total commitment, isn't it? This is the rest of their food that they've now dumped into the sea. They're totally committed to God now. Verse 39 says, and when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. Now, it's day now, right? But they still don't know where they are. They just know it's land. That's all they know. But they see a creek on the beach there. And they're going to try to run this boat into that creek. The water's coming out, and they said it makes sense if a creek or something, a water source is coming into the sea there, that at least it will be, deeper than the sand. And so that's what they're hoping, that they can get in a little closer if they aim for that creek there. Now the storm's trying to force them toward the island. They're already facing there because they put the anchors out the stern of the ship, out the back of the ship. And so it's not going to take much maneuvering to hit this little creek, is it? I mean, just a little bit of steering, maybe raise the sails just a little bit. And so they get rid of the anchors. Look at verse 40. It says, and when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoist up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. Now, our translation's a little bit misleading, because when we think of taking up anchors, we think of what? Pulling them back into the boat. Right? That's not this word here. Right? They are trying to lighten the ship. They are got rid of all the food. They know it's going to destroy this ship when they run it aground. It's not like we need to save the anchors. That's not what this is. The word is, let me see if I can butcher this one, periahireo. Well, that wasn't too bad. But it means to cast off or to remove all around. Right? So when they had taken up the anchors, what it means is they just turned them loose. Right? They pulled them up out of the boat and dropped that part into the sea. And they've let them go, and that, of course, loses some more weight in the ship there. And they want this ship lighter, and that'll allow them to get further in, closer to the shore. And verse 41 says, and falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. Now, what they didn't see, they did see the creek. They did see that water emptying into the sea. What they didn't see is that creek comes out and it diverts two directions around a sandbar. Now the sandbar they can't see because the waves are so violent and strong, and they're just washing over that. Now then when they aim for that creek, they stop short, which is what they didn't want to do. They didn't want to get short. They wanted to get as close as they can to the shore there. But the front of the boat sticks in that sandbar that was hidden in the waves, and then the back of it starts to break up. The storm is beating the waves into it, and it's starting to break up. Now, Paul didn't tell them to do that. Paul didn't tell them to aim for that creek because God didn't tell him to do that. That was their idea. That was their idea. Right? This is an attempt at human wisdom. Man's wisdom. Well, it makes sense to us. That'll probably be the deepest place. We'll aim for that place. Right? And God says, no. No, this isn't about you. It isn't about you fixing the problem, trying to figure out the best way to get it to land. Their hope's already been gone long before this time. Right? And so God stops them right there on that sandbar there. And they have to go back to trusting only God now. They've run aground, they've fallen short, and now the ship is starting to break up. Look at verse 42. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. Now, the soldiers are afraid of losing some prisoners there. You remember, if they're accountable for the prisoner and the prisoner escapes, what happens to them? They have to take their punishment. They have to take their punishment. Some of these are no doubt murderers and all kinds of things. So there will be a big gamut of what that punishment might be there. And so they're not willing to take that chance, and so they tell the centurion, let's just kill them all. we know none will escape that way if we do that. Verse 43 and 44, though, if they do that, that'll also kill Paul, though. He says, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Now, the centurion does want to spare Paul, right? It is because, is it because he knows Paul's innocent? Maybe. Maybe. I think it's more about Paul's giving them the instructions to do what? Stay alive, to survive. He's getting those from God, and then Paul is giving them to them. And so I think it's more about saving their own hide. Everything that Paul has said would happen has now happened up until this point. And so, they have the ones that can swim, jump into water first, try to swim for shore. The rest can't swim, and so they're just grabbing onto anything that'll float, pieces of wood, pieces of ship that are breaking up. And so, but all 276 people jump into the waves still in this horrible storm. All 276 of them make it safely to shore. Now, God said it would happen, and it happened. Right? One of the greatest proofs of the truth of God's Word is the fulfillment of prophecy. When God said something would happen, and then it did happen in a future time. And that's exactly what God has done with Paul and them. God has said, everybody will survive if they all stay in the ship. If they don't try to get in the lifeboat, if they do it God's way, they'll all survive. And now that has happened. We've seen several things of leadership in Paul's journey so far. One of those is he is loved. If you remember back in verse 2 of this chapter, Luke and Aristarchus, they have gone with Paul on this journey. They're with him. They're not prisoners. They paid their own fare. They loved him. They just wanted to be with him on this trip. In verse 3, we saw the same thing when they went up to Sidon there for a little stint from Caesarea there. And we see his friends there that were helping with his physical needs. He's got medical problems, and they go up and minister to him there. I remember hearing a preacher say one time years ago that a pastor was one of the loneliest people in the church. And I thought that was the oddest statement I'd ever heard in my life. Why would the pastor be the loneliest person in the church? And his thinking was because he has to preach the things that are hard for people to hear. It's hard for people to hear certain things, and they don't want to hear those things, and they get their feet stepped on and those type of things. Now, I don't agree with that. It doesn't mean that we're not loved just because you have to say the hard things. It doesn't. Titus 3:15. Paul wrote this way. He says, all that are with me salute thee. Greet them that love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. Amen. Now, was Paul tickling people's ears and telling people what they wanted to hear so they'd like him? No, that wasn't Paul at all. And yet, they still loved him. They still loved him. And it's this deep love because he was doing those things out of love to them. And he was doing it consistently there. I don't know one single person who their parents, if they spanked them and disciplined them while they were growing up, that they hate their parents for doing that. I only hated my parents while they were doing that. That's the only time I hated them. As long as they did it consistently and over time, you realize that's an act of love. And you love them deeper because they did that, because they were trying to teach you and trying to train you, doing those kind of things. And so the same thing's true with Paul. They love him, even though he's had to be hard on them sometimes there. Also, we see not only is he loved, but he is persistent. We saw that same thing from back in verse 3 when he's dealing with those medical problems there. Paul has some chronic health problems. He has a thorn in the flesh for certain that Satan buffets him with, and God's allowing him to still have it. And yet, he keeps going. He keeps going. And I know many of you do the same thing. You have aches and pains and everything imaginable comes and goes, and you do whatever you can do to be faithful to God's things. And so he is persistent. He also is not a fool. He does use good judgment, discernment, and we see practical wisdom back in verse 9 and 10. He warned them not to leave the fair havens, that they'd be putting their lives and the ship in danger. And it was during the dangerous sailing season, not the deadly season yet, but in the dangerous part. And it was really an unnecessary risk there. You remember, Jesus didn't jump off the pinnacle of the temple at Satan's request, even though the angels would have caught him. That's an unnecessary risk. It wasn't appropriate to test God or tempt God in that way. And so Paul didn't want them to just go sailing off into a storm just because he's going to be safe, because it's going to put their lives in danger. Psalm 19, verse 13. Psalm 19, verse 13. We studied this sometime back with Leroy, but in Sunday school. But Psalm 19:13, he says, "Keep back thy servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then shall I be upright, and I shall be innocent from the great transgression." Now, what are presumptuous sins? You ever do something, make a decision based on something you think's going to happen later on? You know, you buy something because you think you can pay for it over time and do those kind of things. And under ideal circumstances, we'll be able to pay this off in this amount of time, and we'll go ahead and buy it now. Right? And, you know, sometimes it may not be that God doesn't want us to buy something, but He may not want us to buy it right now. You know, sometimes we just presume that we won't have to plan, we won't have to save, that we'll just bury ourselves in debt, and we'll trust God to get us out in the end. That's a presumptuous sin. When you presume that God is going to do something in the future, and that's I've lived that life. That's a hard road to plow, as they say. It's a hard lesson to learn, but those are presumptuous sins when we're assuming God is going to do things for us. You know, sometimes we do that with our health. You know, we take chances and we assume that this is, you know, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I know I'm going to hurt, but I just assume God's going to heal me like He did last time, right? I was sore for a few days, and you know what happens? You do that over and over again. Eventually the healing gets a lot slower and it gets a lot harder, and sometimes it's a permanent thing after that, and some of that's presumptuous sins, and so we don't want to be involved in that. We want to trust God and make sure God gives us peace about the decision up front, and we've done everything right for that. Also, we see here another part of Paul's leadership is Paul does have authority. Now, if Paul were speaking from his own human wisdom, he would have no authority on this ship. We talked about that before. That would be like a tent maker trying to tell the sailors and the captain how to run the ship, right? He doesn't know anything about those type of things there. He's a guest on there. That would also be the prisoner trying to give advice to the centurion or the soldiers on the ship about how to keep the prisoners safe and how to best deliver them to Caesar. So in human wisdom, that wouldn't make any sense at all. But if he's speaking for God, then he does have authority. He does have authority there. Also, he strengthens others. He helps others. That's a part of his leadership qualities there. You know, he gives them this little brief admonishment. You know, well, I told you, you shouldn't have left Fair Havens, right? But then he cheers them up. He gives them hope and sees that they have their physical needs met by taking food and doing those kind of things. And he leads by example. Right? He prays, asks God to bless his food, and then he eats, right? And everybody else joins in because they believe he's right. They want to follow him because they know God's blessing him. Also, his faith, there in verse 25, His faith is steadfast and immovable, right? In verse 25, why should they cheer up? Paul says, for I believe God. His faith is still steadfast. He's not panicked. He's not panicked in this trip. Also, as a leader, he demands obedience, not just partial obedience. I got tickled at my niece and her little boy the other day. She was telling him to do something up at Granny's the other day, and he kind of listened, kind of obeyed. And I'm thinking, you kind of need to bust his bottom. What I thought, but I didn't say nothing. But, partial obedience is what? Disobedience. It's not obedience. It can't be. And that's what Paul demands there, and that's what we saw. They couldn't try to do it their own way. Right? There's no compromise with God. And so Paul's not only leading them in these verses, but he's demonstrating that's how salvation works. He's showing them that at this same time. And so we'll see what happens next time after they reach the shore, Lord willing. Any questions or comments, though, so far?